the third best time to overcome objections is when you are good and ready. And what I mean by that is, you just because somebody asked the question or brought up the objection 10 minutes into the presentation doesn't mean that I have to answer it or overcome it 10 minutes into the presentation. And I think sometimes we feel like we have to. There's this, well, I got to answer that right away, but we really don't. So by waiting until I'm good and ready, there's a couple parts of that. One of them is there's a timing and a sequence. Like they're sometimes asking questions that are over here, and I'm taking them through a logical sequence to help them make a good decision. This is for their sake. It's for my sake too, but it's a win-win. Like I'm literally just trying to make this an easy choice by walking them down this linear path where A turns into B, turns into C. And I get to D and they're like, what about M, N, O? And you're like, oh yeah, M, N, O. And then where was I? And then D, and then you go back to D and E, and you lose momentum. You might forget where you are. You might leave out something that you were about to cover, and then when you come back to it, you're like, I feel like I'm forgetting something. There's all those other things that can happen, but to their psychology of the buyer, you're actually making it harder for them to process the information and make a decision. Even though you're giving them what they think they want. They want this answer, and they're like, tell me this, and you're like, oh yeah, I'll tell you this because that's what you want. Just because that's what they think they want, it's not making it easier for them to make a decision. So first of all, it's convincing ourselves that that's not necessarily in the best interest of them to answer that question right then. It would make more sense to them to answer that question or objection in the proper context when we get to that part, right? So if they're talking about something that's, MNOP, let's go ahead and get through L and then circle back to MNOP when it's the right time. But the other thing that kind of going back to why we want to overcome objections before they come up, remember that edge that we get by overcoming an objection before it comes up because they trust us more because we volunteered it and it wasn't in response to them, and we don't, we look like a salesperson just trying to answer them, and all that stuff that goes with answering an objection after they bring it up. We can minimize that by putting it off and dealing with it at a later time. So even if I know that it's an objection I need to overcome, and even if I think it's a great question, it's an important question, but we're not there yet, the next best thing I can do to have already overcome it before it came up is to say, great question, I'm glad you brought that up. We're actually going to be covering that here in just a moment. Or, that's 5 minutes down the line, or when we get to this next page or next section, or whatever, wherever we're at in it. I can confidently embrace that question or objection and let them know that's something I was already planning on covering. That's something that I promise we're going to get to that. And it's the next best thing to reclaiming the objection first so that I own it. It's me telling them I was going to cover it anyway. And I'm not just responding to it because they brought it up. Absolutely. We're going to be covering that. Now, if you genuinely were going to cover it anyway, that's pretty easy. It's pretty obvious. If you know that's something that's literally part of your presentation, it's in the script and it's just in the next part, all you're doing is just keeping things in order and delivering that at its proper place, because it will have more impact and be more effective that way. But even if it wasn't, let's say it was one of those 50-50 objections. Not everybody has it. You don't bring it up every time because you don't want to introduce a new objection, but it is something that you believe in covering if they have that objection, and it is something that is important. It could be a deal breaker. So you're like, okay, now that I know they have that question, I am now going to mold that into the balance of my presentation at the proper time, so that it will now feel like it will become part of my presentation, even if it was an optional 50-50. Sometimes I say it, sometimes I don't. But I give myself permission to deal with that in the proper timing. And now I take back control, which obviously is the other part that I think maybe goes without saying, but the person who asks the questions controls the conversation. So if they ask and I answer, they're in control. And even though I feel like I'm helping them on answering their questions, it's not really effective as a sales tactic. But what is effective is maintaining control and then saying, oh, that I embrace that. I don't freak out. I'm not like, don't worry about that, right? I'm not panicking. I'm not doing all those things that make them feel like, oh, I'm onto something. This is clearly a big concern, and I've hit a nerve. All those things that happen when a salesperson sounds like, looks like, feels like they really didn't want you to bring up that question. So no matter what the question or objection is, I never want to sound like, oh, crap, right? Even if I'm brand new, even if I don't have all the answers, I would still say, great question. That's actually something we're going to be covering here a little bit later on. If I forget, feel free to remind me, but it's going to make sense when we get there. And then go back. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, crap. I don't know what to say to that. But I've bought myself time. I've bought myself time to think about what I'm going to say, to kind of prepare a game plan, or at the very least, if I need to put them on a brief hold for some other reason and then ask somebody like, what do I say about this? Or go get my manager who was already checking on the bill switch thing and be like, hey, I just noticed, Kelvin wasn't busy at the moment, and I kind of have an answer, but I want to give you the best possible answer. So I'm going to have Kelvin answer that. And then boom, now I take the pressure off myself because I wasn't really feeling confident about answering it. And it's really tough to do that in the moment. I can't necessarily make that happen in the moment. He might not be available right in that moment. If I feel like I have to answer that question or deal with that objection right now, then I'm kind of on my own and I'll do the best I can. But I might legitimately need time to get prepared or get help. Okay, so there's that other benefit of waiting until you're good and ready and doing it at the proper point in your presentation where it makes sense logically, when you're prepared, and when it seems like it's your idea, like you were going to do it anyway. So I take back control. I take back ownership of that objection by implying that I was going to cover it anyway, or, I got to it first. They just happened to ask before we got there. So the fact is they are going to be more likely to believe something that I say proactively than if I say it reactively. So I want to take it back and be proactive, incorporate it in, and deal with it at that point. And sometimes you're not even sure if it's a real objection or if it's something you need to overcome, if it's a little bit out there or whatever. Then buying yourself time and saying that's something we'll get to or whatever, that might be one of those ones that you just leave it alone and see if they even bring it up again, because maybe you don't directly overcome that, but maybe when you tell them about the rest of what you're going to tell them, that just fades away. That it doesn't even matter anymore. So I didn't have to overcome it. I just told them something that just obliterated that concern. But really, I'm trying to maintain control so that they don't take control. But I just have seen it happen way too many times on both sides of the table and watching other people where an objection is handled in the wrong way and the sale starts to fall apart. And so I don't want to take that chance. I don't want to give them an opportunity to take control, to take me off on this rabbit trail. I can't afford to have that happen, take me off script. So what I have to do is say, there's a place for that. There's a time for that. We're going to get to that and deal with it, when we're good and ready.